The Roman Empire, as you all know, of course, is notorious for its marked social dependencies. It was a profoundly unequal world in which masters could decide over life or death of their slaves, in which fathers held complete legal power over children, and in which wives were often at the whim of their husbands. Now, ancient history has long foregrounded both these dependencies and their contestation, right? And archaeology has followed suit by trying to identify the presence of such social categories like slaves, like women and children in the archaeological record, and also by attempting to reconstruct, let's say, tactics of resistance and defiance against those dependencies. A prime locus for thinking through Roman social geographies has been the house, and more specifically, all too often still, and I'm doing this myself. I'm going for the classic case studies, whereas we actually should blow up this scholarly dependency, I guess, on Pompeii and Herculaneum. But there we go. So Pompeii and Herculaneum and the houses preserved in the ashes, in the lava flows of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79 are still the classic case study here. And on the photo, you see the atrium of the House of Menander in Pompeii. Now, when you visit these sites or when you see pictures like this, it's very tempting to be awed by this shell of standing architecture, right? Which is a rather static picture. But actually, Roman houses were dynamic organisms. And so this static picture has been translated onto these kinds of ideal plans, floor plans of the Roman house, right? With neatly defined room functions. You can, I think you can read them here at the bottom. So there's kitchens, there's bedrooms, and so on. And this is not only guided by the architectural remains, but also by classical sources, especially Vitruvius and his De Architectura. But archaeology in the last couple of decades has shown that most spaces in these houses were actually multifunctional. So one room could be a semi-public reception space at one moment, or a private dining room at the next, or it could move from a female to a male sphere of action between the morning and the afternoon. And against the top-down viewpoint of the pater familias, the head of household controlling everything in this house, archaeology has stressed how these houses were occupied by what Andrew Wallace Hadrill has called not a household, with its connotations of harmony, of organic growth, but a house full, meaning an open-ended collection of people of diverse status, family relations, and roles. But the question then becomes, how do we document and understand the dynamics of the Roman house full, right? And this is really tricky to do archaeologically. So if we want to foreground these kinds of traditionally underrepresented groups like women or slaves, it becomes a real methodological quagmire. And all too often, it amounts to a static linking of particular kinds of artifacts or visual or material evidence to particular identity groups. So for instance, is a perfume bottle a female object, or was it used by different genders? Do these kinds of rudimentary, like zebra stripe, I don't know if that's a technical term, I'm not a wall painting specialist, but do these kind of rudimentary wall decorations index slave quarters or just utilitarian spaces more generally? So even with all the contextual detail we can dream of, these questions remain very difficult to answer. And it's because they're trapped in what feminist scholarship terms a second wave feminist approach, meaning an approach that looks for material correlates of predefined identity categories. Now, instead of mapping particular functions and particular groups of people onto the floor plans of Roman houses, a third wave feminist approach encourages exploration of local power dynamics and knowledge differentials. It's less interested in identifying a predefined category of women or slaves or whatever, and more in tracing different historical articulations of gender categories. So how was femininity or masculinity defined in a specific context? The idea is that people are what they are what they do and how they do it. And that's a theoretical premise that complicates direct correspondence between objects and people. Now, in this paper and in the book chapter on which, as Professor Bent said, it draws, I want to explore this premise through the lens of storage. And I argue that storage is uniquely suited to investigating the landscape of power and knowledge in these houses, but I'll also explore how it encourages us to expand our lens of social dependencies to include the material world as a participant. As a gatekeeper of the flow of goods, storage is by definition dynamic and temporally structured. And in particular, I argue that it occupies this register of repeated shorter term actions and changes that often escape the archaeological lens. So archaeology often focuses on big change, like rebuilding, restructuring, structural damage. But these kind of small daily actions and repeated actions are difficult to get at. And storage also speaks directly to these third wave feminist concerns with knowledge differentials. Julia Hendon, who works in the New World, makes the case that storage conceals, reveals, and intervenes in a community's mutual knowledge, so that, and I quote her, knowledge itself becomes a way of differentiating people. But storage also draws attention to the role of the material world in negotiating social dependencies. Storage and its facilities have traditionally indexed the institutionalization of dependencies. So models of social-political evolution see the capacity to claim and centralize surplus and to administer its redistribution as a marker, perhaps as the marker, of chiefdoms and states and their institutionalized forms of social inequality. So here the question is, how do inequalities get institutionalized and petrified, so to speak? From the granaries of the Inca Empire to the warehouses in the ports of Imperial Rome, storage facilities have been read as containing surplus, and that abstract currency of power and inequality that binds people into relations of dependency. But what is surplus? Surplus, it turns out, I argue, does not exist. And this is not merely because needs and wants are context specific and variable. And so whatever is purported to be extra or over and above them is context specific as well. And so it's variable as well. But more fundamentally, and more basically, perhaps more commonsensically, people do not gather and store surplus. Instead, they collect cars, they harvest grain, they store canned foods, or as I don't know if people did in Germany, but definitely here in the US, everyone hoarded toilet paper in the first COVID wave, right? So accumulation and storage are practiced and thought about in relation to the specificity of the material world, meaning it's a very basic point, it matters what you store and how you store it, right? And this material world acts back again in all its specificity. This world of things also is not restricted to agricultural products as these grand social-political models have it. Instead, it includes the bits and bobs, the mundane possessions and luxury items, the ritual objects and utilitarian tools that occupied these houses like Pompeii and Herculaneum, and that structured the lives of their inhabitants. So let's travel to Italy and look at these houses. And let's start by asking the very basic question of where and how people store things in these houses of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And my analysis builds on a database of 30 Pompeian atrium houses that were collected by Pim Allison back in the late 90s. And so the data collection as such is, I'm indebted to Pim Allison and to long history of work on these sites. And like all archaeological sets of materials, it's an imperfect data set, but it still offers a rigorous and especially quite consistent sample. If I should say, probably somewhat skewed towards the wealthier inhabitants of these towns. And I can talk more about the data if anyone's interested later. Now, first observation is that specific storerooms, as we maybe think of them, pantries or garages or whatever, were rare in these houses. And so what I did is search Allison's database for 3 categories of objects that she differentiates: storage furniture, fixtures, and vessels. Storage furniture includes remains of chests, cupboards, racks, as well as their fittings, their keys, their doors, and so on. Stored fixtures refer to a range of finds related to shelving, like nails, but also recesses and built-in features. And storage vessels include the obvious suspects like amphora, other closed ceramic containers, but also smaller vessels, some vessels made of organic material. All right, and so the next couple of slides will talk you through that data rather quickly based on this table that summarizes the results of those searches. You can see the main categories of furniture, fixture, and then storage vessels here. And it's still somewhat, because I'm guided by the way P. Mallison collected her data, it's based on her description of rooms, and she tries to avoid these fixed functional labels like bedroom. And instead, she describes rooms more spatially in terms of their architectural and spatial layout. So for instance, she talks about small closed rooms off the side of the front hall, meaning instead of talking about a bedroom, because it could have multiple functions. All right, so what emerges from this is that the front halls or these atria re-emerge as rooms where storage was put on display. And there's a few houses that boasted several items of storage furniture, as you can tell here, like chests, like cupboards in these front halls. And these communicated the kind of wealth and status associated with control of ample resources. Here's an example of a bronze chest from the House of the Vetti. A more common and less outwardly focused practice was to have storage furniture and fixtures in these kinds of smaller, enclosed, decorated and undecorated rooms of the front halls that I talked about earlier. And their functions varied from anything from closet space over actual bedroom to a study to intimate reception spaces and so on. And you can see again that there's, in this case, 58 entries of finds in storage fixtures spread across 20 houses. So it's a fairly common pattern to have storage in these spaces. Portable storage and transport vessels were even more widely distributed across room types. And yet there's a couple of concentrations of these kinds of vessels, again, in the front halls and in the back halls, but also in the upper stories, probable upper stories. And there's also some examples in kitchens or rooms with a hearth. So what emerges is that these central open spaces reveal themselves as a switchboard of circulation and activity within the house, through which supplies were brought in and redistributed along different spaces in the house. So as long as supplies were stored in the atrium, their further destination and eventual use remained open-ended, and they could still be channeled to different spaces, claimed for different activities and needs as they arose. Upon redistribution via the circulation spaces, a majority of these stocks, and probably most of them were indeed foodstuffs, would be ranged out of the way on the first floor. And there's a couple of, not in this picture, but finds of amphora, other containers on the landing of staircases, which provide traces of the physical moving of supply to and from those larders, as it were, on the first floor. Smaller substeds, so the contents of an amphora poured into smaller containers or a single amphora out of a set of amphorae, could then be moved back to more specific activity spaces as and where needed. So amphora was brought in, was carried upstairs, and then when you needed some, I don't know, oil in the kitchen, you'd go pour some out, bring it back to the kitchen. And transvasing to such smaller vessels would already result in a certain recategorization of stored goods, because these small vessels could contain anything, water drawn from the impluvium or olive oil tapped from an amphora. And the modest but widespread numbers of these smaller vessels across rooms indicates storage closer to these products' envisioned use, so there's storage closer to consumption. In addition to the spatially distributed storage pattern, there was a sheer diversity in the nature of storage containers and in the kinds of actions they enabled. And even single types of containers lacked standardization. So there's no standard type of cupboard or chest or so on. The 6 cupboards preserved as charred wood at Herculaneum all present a different form, a different technique. They show, in turn, only slight resemblance to the casts of cupboards that we have from Pompeii. So these are casts made in the same way as the famous casts of the bodies, right? The actual organic material, the wood, was burnt away in the eruption. The void was petrified, and then gypsum, or today more advanced polymers, are poured into that void to create an impression. And even the standardization of vessels like amphora became largely irrelevant in context of storage in these houses, where stores mixed different vessel types, and the likelihood of reuse caused any correspondence between types and content to lose much of its predictive capacity. So you could no longer tell based on a shape or type of amphora what its contents might have been. And indeed, when contents are preserved, it could have been anything. So wine, oil, fish sauce, the usual suspects, but also nuts or dates or other products. Amphora racks installed in shops and bars in Herculaneum, for instance, and they were probably used for decanting wine. So an amphora would be placed inside this, and then you could easily tap some of its content. These have these semicircular notches, but they're all of different size. So they anticipate containers of different size, echoing qualitative differences between the products on offer. Individual storage containers too lacked standardization. So here we have one of the racks preserved, open racks preserved in Herculaneum. And as you can see, there's 3 lower shelves, but then there's this weird upper compartment that's subdivided again. You have cupboards with capricious organization of shelves and doors. So this is a front view of one of the cupboards preserved in Herculaneum. You see 3 shelves, an outer set of door, but then the lowest shelf is closed off by a second set of smaller doors. So this created various nested compartments. And these irregular subdivisions thwarted calculability. So you couldn't gauge volume or nature of the contents just at a glance, so to speak, right? And this was further compounded by the fact that a lot of these doors then needed keys, and so you'd need multiple sets of keys to open them, right? Meanwhile, this nested storage organization also enforced qualitative differences between the stored goods. So by storing different kinds of things in separate compartments or on different shelves, you would emphasize their difference, but also conversely, by allowing qualitatively distinct goods to be brought together in a single container, this kind of compartmentalization also facilitated a kind of conceptual rapprochement. So I'll illustrate this with this example of a cupboard mixed with an aedicula, so a temple for the household cult that was mounted onto a cupboard with closed doors. And it contained a series of figurines of deities, but also, and I quote Stefan Mols, who published a lot of the wooden furniture from Herculaneum, ordinary household articles were found in both parts of the piece. So how do we read this? Is this a practical, rationalized use of space, meaning they just used whatever storage space was available? Or also, I would argue, a semantic issue where different categories were brought together. So ritual objects and utilitarian objects could be brought together precisely because of this nested organization of storage. Now, those rare examples where it's possible to reconstruct the contents of storage furniture show that the different types of containers had little to do with the actual nature of the stored goods and more with the temporal dynamics of storage. Both cupboards and chests could contain a mix of ceramic and glass tableware, lamps, jewelry, small statuettes, foodstuffs. So a cupboard and chest in the atrium of the Casa del Bel Impluvio at Pompeii included, and this is drawn from Joe Barry's work, a silver mirror, silver jug, a silver crochet hook, a gold ring, 2 gold bracelets, 2 silver plated bowls, and so on. Also present were 3 gold coins and a hoard of 298 silver coins. So this is quite a jumble of goods, right? Even if it's a very high-end jumble. So it's not our average, kitchen drawer, but it's still kind of a mess. But while cupboards tended to include a range of these items in smaller quantities, chests seem to have contained sets of materials. Storage of foodstuffs, for instance, could take place both in chests or in cupboards. But for instance, the sole surviving chest of Herculaneum that I showed you earlier contained what the excavation notes described as flour or a kind of cake. Whereas in cupboards, we find some figs and then a range of other objects or a vessel containing fish bones. So this distinction between sets of goods in chests and individual items in cupboards is because I think of the different temporal affordances of these different types of storage furniture, whereby the vertical organization of cupboards with shelves with most content at eye level facilitated overview and accessibility of the stored goods and basically made it easy to find what you needed and place it back. This meant that they preferentially catered for shorter term storage of objects in direct and frequent use. Chests installed on ground level, in contrast, forced users to bend forward, and their contents was visible only from the top of a sometimes multi-layered stack. So all of this suggests a pattern of slower turnover and longer term storage for chests as compared to cupboards. So what emerges from this analysis, and admittedly it's a bit truncated, but I can refer you to the longer written version in the book. But what I want to stress is both the heterogeneous nature of storage assemblages and the role of these temporal dynamics of assemblage making. And so here's a brief foray into the sort of theoretical background to this, or the theoretical premise of how I'm interpreting these assemblages. And it's that things make demands on us. They draw us into their needs as much as we use them to satisfy ours. Such symbiotic, sometimes even parasitic relations between humans and things have been filtered out of archaeology, of other humanities and social sciences by a long Western tradition of reading objects in a utilitarian way. So things are tools and we use them at our whim, basically. In the last 2 decades, the material turn has alerted us to the way not only humans depend on objects to live their lives, to live our lives, but also vice versa, objects depend on people for their maintenance, for their functioning, and also to maintain their semantics, their meaning. Most influential, perhaps, has been Ian Hodder's concept of entanglement, which describes precisely those mutually constitutive human-object dependencies. So, for instance, the use of grinding stones in the Neolithic, according to Hodder, entangled people and things in all sorts of new ways. It facilitated retrieval of nutrients from plants, and this led to an intensified use of plants. It changed techniques of food preparation and helped establish bread as a new dietary norm. It necessitated procurement of these kinds of heavy stones, which in turn made it rather cumbersome to move around and contributed to reducing mobility. So entanglement sets things to work as mediators of human relations and ultimately of historical trajectories. These domesticated cereal plants, in turn, also started depending on human cultivation for their survival, so they could no longer procreate or replicate on their own without humans. So with Hodder, humans depend on things and things depend on humans. And yet, I argue, to avoid drowning in a sea of things and succumbing to their constant signals, humans need ways of mediating their relations with things. Storage, I think, provides one such way of managing this cycling of stuff. As anyone knows who's ever been forced to part ways with a sentimental but defunct object, I have childhood traumas of my father throwing away things I really liked, like a pen case I vividly remember that no longer opened, but I really hated him for throwing it away. Also, I think what for many of us, especially, many of us probably resonates is if you've ever had to help a family member move and downsize, right? Or someone who's moved into a retirement home and they have to let go of all their stuff. Such mediation is more than a trivial project. It orders social relations between humans as well as between humans and things, and it can be constitutive of identity of things as well as people, I would argue. Now, we've seen that most spaces in these Roman houses were multifunctional. In order to effectively use a certain space multifunctionally, it has to be repeatedly recreated into a setting suitable for any of those functions. And that means that it also has to be freed from associations with other functions that it may have at other points in time. Storage, I argue, acted as a mechanism not so much of entanglement, but of disentanglement of spaces and objects. What storage does is take things temporarily out of circulation with a view to future use. So you're putting something away and you're intending to return to it at a later point. Storage shapes the transition between what things have been or have done and what they can be or can do, between past and future in artifact biographies. Its particular nested organization in these Vesuvian houses with whimsical, non-standardized containers with heterogeneous assemblages spread across multiple spaces enabled storage to reframe the potential of the things it assembled and to play a crucial role in enabling and channeling the multifunctional use of space in these houses. In other words, in the Vesuvian houses, putting objects in storage freed up action space from these objects' dependencies. So for instance, after an episode of offering, you can place your ritual objects into this cupboard beneath your mini domestic temple, and the room in question could function without the need to keep observing certain religious dictates. You can then return to it and retrieve the same object for a different purpose. So through storage, objects and spaces in the Vesuvian houses were made to forget their previous histories and associations. As a result, there was a constant composing, decomposing, recomposing of assemblages as selections of things were taken out of or moved into storage. So your same cup could be, could be used in a ritual performance, be placed back into the cupboard, and then you could take it out again and use it as just a drinking cup. So assemblages in storage didn't map onto assemblages framing particular kinds of activities, and these frames needed to be constantly recreated. As a result, there was scope for redefining activities and norms. Sorry, I went too quickly. What it meant both socially and materially to do business or to impress visitors or to study remained open for tweaking and contestation precisely because the corresponding settings had to be recreated. So the settings were always sort of in flux, and so the norms associated with those settings, the social norms for how to enact such settings, were also in flux. So how do these dependencies between humans and things translate to social dependencies between humans? As objects were made to forget, the burden was on people to know what to use on a certain occasion and to remember where they had placed this something. Now, here comes a comparison to put the historicity of these houses' social geography into relief, a comparison not so much with storage practices in real modern Western houses, but with their idealized template that has haunted studies of Roman houses for so long, and that's this kind of template, right? And this still gets propagated today from anything from architects' plans to, as depicted on the slide, doll houses. And what it does is prescribe a more or less precise mapping of space and function. So we're very much back to that ideal plan and Vitruvius with which we started today. As a result of this template, anyone can enter a stranger's house or play with a dollhouse, right? And be able to find, for instance, the toothbrush in the bathroom, pots and pans in the kitchen, books in the living room or study. And I used to have my students to play this game whereby they would draw a floor plan of their apartment or house, and then their neighbor had to locate, say, their toothbrush. And it took seconds, right? We're so accustomed to this normative pattern, to this normative template. Now, this is not to say that the Western storage pattern is static while its ancient counterpart was dynamic. Instead, it shows that in the idealized modern case, functions and meanings are signaled spatially and materially. And I have to say, these thoughts are pre-COVID. I have to say, in COVID, where all this, the degree of flux in our houses has become much larger, I think, when bedrooms have become offices and childcare spaces and so on. So what storage does in this idealized template is provide normative standardized setting where spoons and plates are stored in the kitchen, toothbrushes in the bathroom, sofas and tables frame the living room. In such an organization, artifacts are very unlikely to ever forget their associations precisely because they're constantly reminded of them by their setting of storage and use, which overlap neatly. This lifts the burden from people, whether it's those inhabiting the spaces or those merely passing through, but within the same cultural vocabulary, to remember where things are stored or what they might be for. Analysis of the modalities of storage suggests that it would be rather more difficult for people living in Pompeii or Herculaneum in the 1st century AD to enter someone else's house and navigate one's way through spaces and assemblages. Things were not necessarily stored in the spaces in which they were used. Access, and I didn't talk about that today, but access could be redirected temporally and spatially. So there was a whole system from doors to curtains that could leave through some sounds, but not sight, and so on. And locking devices, I talked about that a little bit, were idiosyncratic. So the bottom line is that knowledge of what was being stored and where was bound to be partial, embodied, and materially negotiated. Unlike this ideal template of the Western house, space and storage provided no material reminder about function and didn't steer meaning in the same way. Instead, one actually had to remember where one placed a certain object, in which space, in which cupboard, on which shelf. Now, the more things were made to forget, the more people were forced to remember. And this depended on embodied experience, so the personal memory of seeing, placing, or retrieving things in certain places. It's no coincidence that the house with its spaces, its furnishings, and its decoration was foregrounded as a mnemonic device by Roman orators like Cicero, like Quintilian. Both the structure and content of a speech could be evoked by imagining a stroll through one's house, experiencing the effective qualities of its spaces and recalling the detail of its furnishings. So movement and memory went hand in hand, both embodied and became defining of people's understanding of themselves and the world. More empirically accessible is how the compartmentalization and the lack of standardization of storage containers, as I discussed in the first half of this paper, made it difficult to impose a managerial calculation-based strategy. So you couldn't make abstraction of the actual containers, of their parts, of their contents in evaluating storage, its capacity, or its use. So for instance, a cupboard was never just full. Instead, you had to characterize its content in a precise way in terms of location. So it's in the upper left corner of the shelf, or it's alongside the nice dishes, and in terms of its nature. For instance, the 4 bowls that we used for last week's dinner, or the high quality Falernian that was just delivered by our usual trader. There was no bird's eye view, no neutral perspective from which to evaluate what was being stored and where, no all-encompassing gaze. Add to this the previous observation that the constant recomposition of settings and assemblages came with an equally continuous redefinition and tweaking of normative behavior, and we can start painting a picture of the knowledge landscape in these Vesuvian houses. Now, in the kinds of models of socio-political evolution, which I critiqued at the start of this paper when I was critiquing surplus as a concept, the control of storage and its attendant knowledge are assumed to have been centralized. The storage is generally thought to have actually actively facilitated such centralized management, as in the developments of states and empires. At Pompeii and Herculaneum, instead, what we see is that the archaeology of storage suggests a system that, at least in part, defied a centralized, all-knowing gaze. The knowledge and thus the power relations fostered by storage in these contexts was embodied, it was closely dependent on an individual's personal experience and memory. And it was bound to be fragmented. So no single household member, or houseful member, I should say, would have carried all this knowledge at once. While the overall knowledge distribution may well have been uneven, I'm not claiming this is some sort of totally equally divided, distributed knowledge landscape. Some people, no doubt, had greater access to certain spaces in the house, but it was never total. So this was a fragmented knowledge landscape in which top-down power hit its limits, in which there was scope for contestation, and in which knowledge was embodied and defied centralized control. Storage not only funneled assemblages of things, but equally of people, composing and recomposing relations between users of the domestic space. An added sting here is the opportunity which this fragmented knowledge landscape offered for various actors in the Roman house to appropriate stored objects and foodstuffs or to keep property secret. So legal and literary sources recount petty thievery by slaves, but my analysis of the geography of storage suggests that actually only a small fraction of these cases might have been caught, because patterns of movement and visibility show that many of these rooms were hidden from the master's gaze. And so Sandra Joschel and Lauren Hackworth-Peterson suggest that slave could have used these spaces to, like, under stair storage, to withdraw either themselves or stolen goods from sight. Such a potential choreography of resistance, I argue, reveals more about the overall distribution of knowledge and power in the house and of the attendant social roles than it does about any one specific social group like slaves. So other people in this houseful could equally have had their tried and tested hiding places, beneath the staircase or in a dark corner somewhere. This finally brings us to trust, which I'm sure you'll know much more about than me, but it's a key variable in relations of dependencies, like that between master and slave. While we cannot archaeologically speak to any one such specific relation, it's possible to say that this fragmented knowledge landscape in the Vesuvian houses translated either trust or distrust into a constantly shifting social landscape of insiders and outsiders. So some people knew where something had been placed, by whom, when, and some did not. In this knowledge landscape, however small scale and intimate it may have been, what one needed to do was to make allies, and this was both with people and things. So there wasn't much scope for an abstract way of building relations of trust with people and things. There was not much accountability in that sense. Neither people nor things could be expected to be what or where you expected, or act how you had hoped they would. So, we cannot, I argue, think about social dependencies without considering both humans and things. And this is not just because things are often by necessity a proxy for humans. We cannot see many of the human actors in our narratives, and especially not those humans that drew the short end of the inequality stick, so to speak, right? Women, slaves, children. They didn't leave us written sources or textual sources. So what we need things through which to identify them. And indeed, archaeology has often been praised for its more democratic access or representation of the ancient world. Instead, we need to also include things because they actively intervene in social dependencies. They shape them, they structured them, and we would get a very partial and frankly a wrong picture by filtering out the material world. Again, I'm not the first to argue this, and indeed back to Hodder's model of entanglement that garnered a big following, making just this case. Such a big following, in fact, that a quick Google search raises the question, is anything not entangled, right? It's become a stand-in for all kinds of relations. Humans and things are entangled, humans and animals, there's cultural entanglement, and so on. And the list continues. Now, while entanglement infuses human-thing relations with a much needed sense of temporality, it does so, I argue, in a narrow linear sense, whereby the Neolithic Revolution, again, is reframed as an increasing entanglement. People becoming more and more dependent on things, and the other way around, people being increasingly drawn into things' needs, for instance, for maintenance or for reproduction. But if we follow this logic, then we get a very simplistic picture of history and ultimately evolution, right? A simple linear story of increasing entanglement, increasing dependency of people and things. And this, I think, is dangerous because it threatens to revert the discipline to these much scolded models of social political evolutions, the kind of models that paradoxically are happy to replace the specificity of human-thing relations with abstract concepts like surplus. But it also doesn't hold up to the scrutiny of everyday practice, because if you would follow through the Neolithic path dependency to the present day, we'd all be paralyzed by these sprawling relations, right? Granted, we have all this stuff, we have so much stuff, but we're still able to live our lives. We're not constantly drawn into all of these things' needs, or our attention is not constantly required by all of this stuff. So disentanglement, I argue, deserves just as much attention. How do people negotiate things calls for their attention? How do they halt, pause, challenge, or subvert things' dependency on them and their dependency on things? In answering this question, it's not enough to simply add disentanglement to our lexicon to say, okay, so we'll also talk about disentanglement. Instead, what we need to do, I think, is to think about these knowledge landscapes, right? Which we could think of more generally as the situated relational landscapes of dependencies and their impact on action. And this is a very different way to think about and search for the marked social dependencies that so preoccupy us, and rightly so when studying the Roman world. It's a way of addressing the multifunctionality of these houses without positing problematic functional categories at the outset, like bedrooms or sleeping. And it's a way of opening up action space and power claims for the kinds of traditionally underrepresented groups that archaeology has been at pains to find in these houses, in particular women and slaves. But it does so without falling into that trap of positing these groups as a priori analytical categories. So we're not setting out to find women as second wave feminism sought to do. So the picture I've sketched for the Roman houses of Pompeii and Herculaneum of a fragmented knowledge landscape by no means wants to be an all-encompassing model for the Roman world. Instead, what I hope to have done is to have presented a methodological and theoretical starting point for how we can trace other such topologies of dependency within and beyond the Roman world. So that's my modest contribution for today, and I'll be keen to hear your thoughts and any questions you may have.